It's official. It's Booker season, baby. I'm actually not sure I can pull that off, but let me draft in someone who can.
It's Booker season, baby.
Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. Another year and another Booker long list, and I'm sure you are drowning in reaction videos right now, but here I am to add another one to the pile. I have been so excited for this year's long list reveal, although it feels like it's been going on forever. The build-up has been an absolute age this time around. But you know what? My first impressions of the list are really good. It definitely seems like a more diverse list than last year's in terms of like the themes and the type of book, although perhaps it's not really that diverse in some other ways. In any case, I am super excited to get into these books, and that's got to be a good sign. First up, let's talk predictions. This year, I managed to get 3 books correct. I got James, This Strange Eventful History, and Orbital. That's one better than I did last year, but still nothing really to write home about. But hey, these things are quite difficult to predict. Well, they are usually difficult to predict, but this year the list has been leakier than a Welshman's dinner. I think like almost half the list had leaked before lots of people over on Instagram had even had a chance to make their predictions this year. But you know what? Predictions schmedictions. What I'm more interested in this year is whether the formula I used to make my predictions was on the money. I covered this a little bit in my predictions video, but here are the criteria I used to put my predictions list together. They were kind of guiding principles to help me create a list that would look like a similar shape to those in the last decade. So let's assess the long list we actually got against these criteria one by one. First, I was expecting 8 books from the publishers I'm calling the Booker Bigwigs. 12 imprints of huge publishers that between them have been responsible for something like 2/3 of all longlisted books in the last 10 years. And we ended up with 8 books from them. The mad thing about this number is that while Bloomsbury got 1 of those books, the remaining 7 of the 8 came from imprints of Penguin Random House. Hutchinson Heinemann had 1, Penguin Viking had 2, and Jonathan Cape had a whopping 4 books on the list. You know, I'm actually a little bit annoyed at myself because, as you might know, one of my favourite parts of like the whole predictions process is coming up with stupid category names to group the predictions by. And in one version of my predictions list, there was a category I called Cape Expectations because between 2014 and 2019, Jonathan Cape was one of, if not the most reliably longlisted imprints. They had 11 titles nominated in that short period of time. But since then, they haven't had a single book longlisted. I had a feeling that they might make a comeback this year and had both Orbital and Wild Houses on an early version of my predictions. In the end, I decided I was keeping them in more because I liked the category name than the actual predictions, and so I ditched Wild Houses. Flash forward to the actual longlist announcement, and not only are both of those on the list, but 2 more Jonathan Cape titles are there as well, Creation Lake and Enlightenment. It is an incredible resurgence for them and a big contributing factor in Penguin Random House's dominance on this list. Next, we normally have 1 to 2 smaller or indie presses, and this year we have just 1, Headshot, which is from Daunt. I'm kind of counting Daunt as an indie here, which you could probably argue against, but I always get a lot of small press energy from them, potentially because they always publish in paperback. Finally, I was expecting 3 to 4 books from bigger publishers, but ones outside of those Booker Bigwigs. There are 4 of these this year. We've got 1 from Mantle, 1 from Fleet, 1 from Scepter, plus there's a Harvey Secker book, which is another Penguin Random House imprint. Some people, perhaps very fairly, have decried the lack of indies on the list this year. And while it would have been really cool to see some smaller or indie presses on the list, what we've got here isn't unusual. Penguin Random House have been dominant, but actually the publishers that have lost out to them are ones like Faber, Fourth Estate, and all of Pam Macmillan's imprints. These publishers would usually be featured, but are all absent, save for Mantle, an imprint of Pam Macmillan, who have got James on the list. Faber have not missed out on a long list since 2014, so it was a real shock not to see a title from them. We typically also see 2 to 3 overlaps with the Orwell Prize for political fiction, and this year we've got 3 of those, including the winner, My Friends. Then there are also usually 3 formally shortlisted authors, and again this list is delivering exactly that. We've got Richard Powers, Rachel Kushner, and Percival Everett. Finally, there are almost always 1 or 2 of those Booker Bigwig publishers with multiple books on the list. As mentioned already, we've got 2 of those, Penguin Viking and Jonathan Cape, but I can't stress how unusual it is for a publisher to have 4 books on the list like Jonathan Cape have achieved this year. So my evaluation of the formula is it basically worked. I just picked the wrong books. It's perhaps also quite interesting to look at the books and the authors in terms of their geographical spread. We've got 3 titles from the UK, one of which is by a British Libyan author who was actually born in the US. We've got 1 book from Ireland, 1 from the Netherlands, 1 from Canada, 1 from Australia, and then utter dominance really by the US with 6 titles on the list. The map on screen, by the way, is somewhat approximate, so if things are not exactly where they should be, you have my sincere apologies. I did get asked how I felt as a British person to see a prize that was historically limited to British and Commonwealth authors dominated by Americans, and I'm totally fine with it. What I want to see are the best books on the list, and if Americans are the ones writing them, then that's great. I do wonder though if there's a bit of underrepresentation for African and Caribbean authors. It's an exceptionally white longlist featuring 10 white authors, and there's been some great African and Caribbean literature released in the last year. But on the other hand, I do like that we've got a continental European author in there, and it's great that the Booker has finally remembered that Australia exists. One day we might even see New Zealand back on the list. There are also 8 women featured, which is amazing. Ultimately though, you can't put a list like this together based on quotas. It's not possible to represent everyone who writes in English and has a story worth telling. So the judges need to curate the list on merit, but with their biases in mind so that they don't give in to them. I'm unwilling to say if a list is good or bad simply based on its demographics, but I think it's interesting and important to at least recognise that stuff. Whether this is the right list, well, I think that is all in the reading of it. There are, of course, some obvious omissions here. Praiseworthy was hotly tipped and has been on a bit of a dream run through this year's book prize season, and lots of people were expecting and hoping to see it on the list. Similarly, Chigozie Obioma's The Road to the Country has been very well received, and he's been Booker shortlisted for everything he's written before now, so it seemed like an obvious inclusion. Until it wasn't. And plenty more worthy seeming titles have missed out. Booker catnip like Andrew O'Hagan's Caledonian Road, or a wondrous debut like Ferdia Lennon's Glorious Exploits. I read this recently and adored it, and I'll be reviewing it soon, but it would have been a brilliant addition to the list. But look, book prizes are subjective and no book has a right to be on this list. What we've been given by the Booker is an emotional and intellectual reaction of just 5 people to the 150, 160 books that they've read in the last 6 months. I'm not going to get myself frustrated if it turns out that their taste doesn't exactly match mine. And like I said, I haven't read most of these books yet, so I can't be sure. Although the ones I have read, I've really liked. That concludes my rambling reaction to the long list. So let's do a quick run through of the books, and we'll start with the ones that I predicted. So first I got James. I am not alone in predicting this. This was on everyone's list. This comes from Percival Everett, who is a formerly shortlisted author. And I think this is surely the one to beat at this stage. This is an incredible book that has been universally loved. If you have not heard of it, where have you been? It is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of the runaway slave Jim. And it is heartbreaking and funny and horrifying and beautifully written, and I absolutely loved it. I look forward to seeing it on the shortlist. Then I also predicted Claire Messud's This Strange Eventful History. This is, I think, probably the longest book on the list, if Creation Lake is not longer. This is a bit of a sweeping epic historical fiction about one family, very much based on Claire Messud's personal family history, and their experience of displacement and nation building, and this sort of really intimate portrayal of lots of different people over a number of generations. I think it spans about 70 years. I've been really excited about this. I love the concept of it. It feels like the sort of thing that I absolutely dig. A few people have had quite mixed, leaning negative reactions to this book. They've said that like the minutiae of it is a little bit boring. So I wonder if where this is going to fall for me very heavily depends on like how much I'm into the writing, because I find like really boring details can be really interesting so long as you love the writing style of the author. So still excited for now, very intrigued to see how I feel about it. And then finally, I correctly predicted Samantha Harvey's Orbital. This is about 6 astronauts who complete one sort of full Earth day, 16 orbits of the Earth from the International Space Station. It's a really interesting and meditative take on meaning and art and beauty and humanity and Earth's many problems and how they feel from such a distance. I really enjoyed this. I'm not 100% sure if I'm gonna remember everything about it, but it is quite a short book, so it's one that could probably withstand a reread because I think there's a lot crammed into a very small space. Also got just a really gorgeous cover. Oh, and I reviewed this one just in my most recent wrap-up, so I'll link to that video down in the description. Then there were a couple of books on the list that I was pleasantly surprised that I'd already read, but hadn't predicted, although a few other people had. The first one of those was Headshot by Rita Bullwinkel. This one I actually reviewed very recently. It's in the same video as the Orbital review, so if you want to check out what I think of this book in full, you can have a look at that video. But I really, really liked this book. I think it interestingly does a very similar thing to Orbital. So the conceit of this novel is that it's taking place at this boxing tournament called the Daughters of America Cup. There's 8 characters. We get into each of their heads and into this like weird shared headspace between them. And we take a really close look at them, but a really wide angle view of like their lives and the world. And that's very similar to what Orbital's doing with the astronauts. So this was actually the first title that leaked from this year's long list. I think it was like a week and a half ago that it leaked on the internet. And actually that's a little bit disappointing because this would have been a massive and delightful surprise if the first time we heard of it was when it appeared in the announcement video. But the fact that it was revealed to be on the list made me think that it was less likely that Orbital would be because they seem so similar to me. Nevertheless, I am thrilled to see this book recognised. I actually thought it might have been a contender for the Women's Prize this year. It was on my predictions for that, but I didn't consider it for the Booker, and obviously I'm an idiot for not doing so because it's a bloody delight. I've also already read Wild Houses by Colin Barrett, and this is a surprisingly gentle novel, actually. Surprising because of what it's about. It's about this young man who is kidnapped by these 2 pretty inept drug dealers, and they are taken to a house out in the countryside where they've taken advantage of the man who lives there to like store their drugs and operate from that house. I think it's like the county lines stuff, if you've ever heard of that. And it's told from a bunch of different perspectives, but primarily from the guy who's been abducted, both sort of before and in the lead up to the abduction, and from the perspective of the man whose house he's been taken to. And I thought this had a lot of heart, it had humour, I found it quite moving, and I just really enjoyed it. I actually read this last year in Betwixtmas, but that was after I'd already compiled my list of the best reads of the year. And I think had I read this before I put that list together, it may well have been a contender for the top 10, if not an honourable mention, because I absolutely love this book. Then we have a whole heap of books that I did not predict and I have not read. And we'll start with Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. Tommy Orange is a Native American author, and his long listing makes him the first ever Native American author to be nominated for the Booker Prize. I did actually have to go and check that because I thought Louise Erdrich probably would have been nominated at some point, but no, I think she has just been heavily predicted in the past, but never actually been nominated. This is a multi-generational family story about Native American people, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit hesitant with this one because I have not read There by Tommy Orange, and I actually am not sure if this is a sequel or a prequel. It's a direct follow-up in some ways. I've heard it can be read as a standalone, and I'm going to have to read it like that because I just don't have time to read There first. Although if I am making a huge mistake with that, please do let me know. Then we have The Safekeep by Yael van der Woden, and I think this is cool because it's a rare instance of an author being nominated who is not from a country where English is the first language or the official language. She's from the Netherlands. This has been on my radar for a little while because I think I saw Darmot Hester, who is an author and professor at Cambridge. He was reading this before it was released and was raving about it, saying it was really great, and I trust his taste, so I assume this is really good. It's set, I think, 15 years after the end of World War II, and it's about a woman whose brother brings into their family home his new girlfriend, and she's the infuriating antithesis of the protagonist. I think that leads to some obsession and lots of stuff around objects and possessions, and it's also supposed to be quite saucy. I have just read a very sex-filled book, so I might start my Booker journey off with something a little bit more wholesome and save this one for a bit later. Then we jump back from post-World War II to World War I and post-World War I with Held by Anne Michaels. Anne Michaels is a previous recipient of the Women's Prize back when it was called the Orange Prize, I think, for fugitive pieces. This is her latest novel set at the end of the First World War and then in the years after, and I think it's a story that spans multiple generations. It's quite fragmentary inside, like there's quite a lot of white space on the pages. It apparently plays a lot with connection and memory and time, and that's all stuff that really appeals to me. So I don't know or even want to know too much more about this. I kind of want to go into it blind and see what she does. I would say I wouldn't normally pick this book up without prompting, so it's great that it's on the list, and I am hearing some really good things about it so far from people who have read it. Next up, people of Australia rejoice, or maybe try to be less salty about the fact that Alexis Wright is not on the list, because there is a book from Australia on the list. It is Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. And this one I didn't know too much about, other than the fact that Simon Savage had been raving about it. As soon as I saw this one appear on the video, I immediately thought of him and thought he'd be very happy with it. Anyway, this one is about a woman in Sydney who's burnt out, and she sort of runs away from her life back to where she grew up, to this small religious community in the outback. And then spooky shit starts happening. I had a flick through this, and the writing style is pretty striking, actually. So I'm intrigued to see how that holds up across the whole of the book. And I do like that cover. They've done well with covers this year. And if that book made me think of Simon Savage, the next one made me start to suspect that maybe he was a sneaky sixth judge on the panel, because it was Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, and I know Simon absolutely loved The Essex Serpent and would also be very happy to see this on the list. I think this is probably among the most surprising books on the list, because it seems like the marketing leans more into this being commercial fiction than literary fiction, and the Booker has focused a lot more on literary fiction in recent years. I'll be honest, I wouldn't normally be drawn to this. I probably wouldn't have picked it up otherwise. But having read the blurb, it does sound quite appealing. It's a story of intergenerational friendship, it's about the pursuit of science, it's got some astronomy in there, and it's set in Essex, and you may know that I am a recovering Essex boy. It also has probably the most beautiful cover. If the Booker was on finest cover and not finest fiction, I think this would still be on the long list and maybe in with a chance for the win. Then we have another book that's been quite widely predicted, and that is My Friends by Hisham Matar, which looks like a big fat chunky book, but actually the font is quite big, so I think it's not as big and scary as it makes itself out to be. This is a book about the friendship between three Libyan men who are living in exile in the UK, and how they cope with sort of living in that in-between space of identities. I am assured by almost everyone who has read this that it is excellent, and it is the winner of the Orwell Prize for political fiction. So I'm pretty looking forward to reading it. Then our final two books are ones that are not out yet and are actually not out until September. One of them I do very thankfully have a copy of, and that is Playground by Richard Powers. I'm very grateful to have this proof, not just because it means I can read it sooner, but also because I love this cover. I actually like it quite a lot more than the final hardback cover. And they did not give me this because they love me. I actually won a giveaway on Instagram. So if you see those giveaways, it is definitely worth entering. This book is about essentially a bunch of people whose lives have something to do with this plan for floating autonomous cities in the sea. I have a feeling that this might be for the sea what the overstory was for forests and trees. And I absolutely loved the overstory, so I'm so excited to read this. I'm kind of annoyed at myself that I haven't read this sooner, because I've had this for a couple of months now. But yeah, I'm a real little Richard Powers fanboy, so very happy to see him on the list again. Very excited to read this. Finally, rounding out the long list, we've got Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. This is another one that's not out until September, and I haven't managed to get my hands on a copy of it yet. It's about a woman who goes undercover to infiltrate a commune of eco-activists in France. So it's got these big spy thriller vibes, and that's only heightened by a quote I saw from The Observer, which described it as being like Kill Bill written by John le Carré. I see this, at least for now, before many people have read it and given their opinions on it, that this is another bit of a surprise for the list, because although Kushner has been shortlisted before, the description of this book makes it seem quite genre-tinged, and genre fiction rarely makes a dent on the Booker. Until I managed to get a copy of this one though, I'm going to keep another yellow book at the top of my Booker stack. So there we go, the Booker build-up buzz is over again for another year, and we've got 13 new Booker nominated titles to dive into. I would love to know what you make of the long list down in the comments, like whether you're happy with it or not, if there are any titles that you're particularly excited to dive into, and how you feel about the Penguin Random House dominance. I'm a little bit unsure at this point what form my Booker content will look like from here on out. I'm half tempted to do another first line ranking like I did for the International original Booker prize because that was quite fun. And I don't yet know if I'm going to review them in batches like I did last year, or if I'll just save them and do them all in one go. If you've got any preferences about how you'd like to see my Booker reviews, please do let me know. As ever, if you liked this video, please do hit like, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a great time to hit the subscribe button. But until next time, toodles.